Welcome to the Aquatic Ape. I'm John Bear Raber, and this is a presentation about another universal theory of mine. Actually, it's not my theory. The aquatic ape was first coined back in the 1940s, I believe, 40s to 60s, by a man called Alistair Hardy. And he was a scientist, and he came up with the original aquatic ape theory and wrote an article on it in a scientific journal. Unfortunately, he found a lot of mocking of him by his colleagues who felt it was a theory based on nothing, as they called it, another universal theory. And ultimately, he dropped the aquatic ape and they developed another term called the waterside hypothesis. And that was actually brought up, I believe, by a filmographer, Elaine Morgan, in the 1970s, who did some videos that she talked about the waterside hypothesis and where man came from. Now, this is what it's all coming to, the beginnings of humans. We have a lot of theory that are based mostly on skeletal remains and campfires and such, but there's a lot of holes. And scientists are very reticent about going back and saying we know something or we know something else unless there's literally proof of it. On the other hand, in my experiences in doing any kind of research, most research relates to points, and when you fill in enough points, you can draw in the lines between the points to come up with a viable potential for what happened. And unless you can somehow go back in time, that's about all you're ever going to be able to do, is come up with a viable potential. Now, humans became bipedal somewhere between 1 and 5 million years ago. We stood up. Question: why? What caused humans to stand up? Common theory is, they were in tall grasses and they had to stand up to see beyond the grass. Unfortunately, if they would have stood up to see beyond the grass, they would have been seen beyond the grass. And humans have a very common feature among humans that isn't so common to any other what we would call wild animal. We have no claws, we have no fangs, we have no broad, powerful shoulders like gorillas. We are, in fact, vulnerable in all sorts of ways. I mean, a small bug can kill us. So how did humans actually survive? It takes 9 months from the seed and egg joining before there is a viable entity separate from the mother. It takes another 6 years before they're old enough to really start being productive. And in the hunter-gatherer period, which is what this is, it was 15 years and they were an adult. At 15 years, they could have their own children. So one generation in those days in the hunter-gatherer period would probably have been about 15 years. And the hunter-gatherers in the early humanoid periods, or the early human periods, which is what I'd rather say, not humanoids, but actual humans, you were hunter-gatherers, you were a family gathering, a family group. The family group would be a very well worked out machine. And each element, each part of the family would have responsibilities, and they'd be trained to be able to do everything they needed to do by the adults before them. So as you went from being 6 years old to 12 years old, you were an apprentice to everybody in your family, learning how to do everything from making fire when you knew how to make fires, or making tools, or protecting the family from anything from bugs to snakes to lions and tigers and bears. So that would have been the hunter-gatherer family. Now, they would have been mobile. They had to go from place to place. They couldn't just live on the beach and eat only mussels for a couple of reasons. Number one, predators would find them and probably not let them stay there. Number two, there's always going to be times when there's hurricanes or storms where they're going to have to move away from the coast, or at least up a river to where they weren't subject to the pounding right at the shore or at the lake. And they would have to be able to find different types of food sources as they ripened. So there'd be movement. Now, the fact that they were a family group didn't mean that they were the only humans around. There would probably be 3 or 4 or 5 family groups that were in similar areas, and in certain places when they were on the shores gathering mussels, they could have probably all been together at the same time, which gave a lot of opportunity for new children to be made, because you'd want different families to be involved in making children. On the other hand, the family, when you got out to the berry bushes, into the trees, you need a larger area to provide enough food for all the people in all the various family groups. So different times of the year you would have different chances to get together, and different times when you had to be apart so that everybody had enough food to eat. And based on my calculations, which are just my own rough calculations, I'm assuming that a singular group of families would occupy approximately 100 miles wide by 100 miles deep area. That's, well, technically 50 miles going from one shore down one way of the shore, 50 miles going up the other shore, and maybe as much as 100 miles going up the river, because you always had to have water, and that was critical. You can't live by the ocean in salt water without having a regular supply of fresh water. So they would always find a place where there was some water coming in, and a small river. Even if the river didn't go back 100 miles, I'm sure the tributaries with the creeks would, and they'd still be able to find springs and such along the way. So that's about the area that a group of families could live and work and exist together, protecting each other, helping each other, and gathering together for all kinds of wonderful things, like trading. Person finds a new tool, a new way to make something, trading that information to the other family groups. But then at some time, if you're successful, they're going to get big enough to where they're going to have to divide. So when the family goes from 30 to being 45 or 50, now you're better off breaking down into 225 persons, and probably all the families would be about as successful. So you do that together, and the one group would move 100 miles away, further up the shore or down the shore, so that there'd be 50 miles for each of them for their food sources, and they'd only be a week at the most apart for a walk to get together again, because they're still family. They're just divided and gone to another area. Or a runner could probably make it in 2 or 3 days. So that's how I see the early progression of the way the people were. Now, the question is, when were the first humans humans? And one of the theories is, well, the out of Africa theory. Once humans were viable and able to grow, that would be the first time they would move out of Africa. And the out of Africa period has been pinned to about 50,000 to 80,000 years ago, which I find hard to believe. My expectation is it probably goes back maybe 200 or 300,000 years, but the problem would have been some of the lines of communications as these people move further and further apart would get broken. Animals would come in that raided some of the areas and killed whole families off. Storms would come through and destroy the foodstuff for an area, which made people move further apart. And then you have 70,000 years ago, of course, the supervolcano Toba, which is located, if you can see it on the map here, right in this area here, these islands, somewhere in these islands north of Australia and south of China, that when it erupted, it put the amount of ash in the air that totally covered the northern portion of the world, and they believe it killed all the humans that were north of the equator at that time. Now, that theory doesn't hold at all, because we know in Europe, here, north of the equator, Neanderthals lived from 130,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. For them to live only in the north for that 100,000 years, beyond both sides of Toba, they had to survive Toba. How did they survive Toba? Well, the Neanderthals were water-based people, which they probably were. They could have lived on the shores, and even though lack of sun would have killed all the plants and animals, or most of the plants and animals, making it very hard for them to find foodstuff, the ocean wouldn't have been equally encountered. They would have redeveloped the ocean life very quickly. The mussels would have been okay, the crawfish and the urchins and the starfish, anything that was edible on the shore would have still been there, and they could have made it through the 4 years of the ash in the air to actually survive and make it from 130,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. And if they could do it, so could have humans anywhere in the northern portion that had access to a water element, such as along the Pacific coast of the Americas, along the Pacific coast of China, around the Indian Ocean, and even down into Africa. So I think there were people that were moving out long before Toba. Otherwise, the so-called Toba bottleneck, where they say all the people today come from the bottleneck in Toba, if nobody up here would have survived, that means that whole group of people came from down here to come back up through Toba, and I don't feel that was viable. I think people would have been successful and spread out much earlier than just 40 to 60 or 50 to 80,000 years ago. And another reason to argue that is they say Australia has been inhabited. Australia is down here, right here on this map. Australia has been inhabited for somewhere around 40 to 60,000 years, which would have been after Toba. But would it have been possible in less than 10,000 years for them to move all the way from Africa and redevelop all the way back into Australia and actually end up in Australia if everybody north of the equator had been killed? I think it would have taken a little bit longer than that. So I assume that there's been a number of migrations and expansions, if you will. All things tend to grow. Even people, if you're a successful organism, which people became successful, and we know that, we have proof of that, we're here. If we weren't successful, we wouldn't be here now. So that gives you pretty good evidence that we were successful as much as at least 50 to 80,000 years ago, and quite possibly as much as 200, 250,000 years ago. Were they humans yet? Who knows? But my opinion is we probably had humans still coming out of Africa as much as maybe 200,000 years ago. Now, basically the movement of people, as I said, we know that people have been in Africa for millions of years. That first humanoids came from Africa, at least that's what everything shows today. Now that may not be true either. We're guessing based on where the oldest skeletons have been found. If in fact the waterside hypothesis is appropriate and really works, we have another reason why we can't find evidence, because we know that as the earth warms and cools, the ice caps melt. When the ice caps melt, the water comes up. When it gets cold again, the ice caps form, taking water out of the oceans, and the water goes down. If we're living on the water side, that means when the water's up, we're further inland. When the water's down, we're further out in the water. Either way, between a million years ago, between the erosion and the water action, there'd be nothing to find, no bones, no tools, because either way, between the erosion and the water action, it would have hidden it. Now, what do we find? Footprints in stone that was mud. Once again, feeding into the idea of the waterside hypothesis. That would be a good reason why those footprints would have been found. These were people living on the side of the water, and their footprints, basically, all of a sudden, climate changed. What was mud became hard mud, and then over time, if they didn't get washed away, they became rock. And that's why we're finding those footprints in rock. Much as we're finding footprints of dinosaurs in rock all over the Americas right now. Now, South America, everybody says South America, which is way over here, was first settled about 10,000 years ago. And I don't disagree with that. But I did a little experiment recently. I took my calipers here, and I took the measurement of 500 on this map, and I started measuring about how long it is on the shore. And I got a measurement that said from Africa, in this area here, which is probably where the people started, the people would have had to go about 9,000 miles to get up to the Bering Strait. On the other hand, I did the same measurement on this map down here, which looks a lot smaller, but rather interestingly, you can see how close the two are. The smaller one is for this map, the larger one's for that map, but those are both 500-mile measurements. So on the smaller map, I did the exact same measurement. Now remember, this map is not true to size because everything's been made into a square and things up here are much bigger than they appear. This strip of area is about right, but when you start measuring up in the Alaska, up in China, down in Australia, you're getting out of that band and the measurements are grossly wrong. So when I took this and measured the same measurement starting in Africa, same place, and moving along there, along China, down to Australia and up to the Bering Strait, and then down the western coast of the Americas, I found that it was instead of 16,000 miles to the Bering Strait, it was only 13,000 miles to the Bering Strait, and that Australia was only 9,000 miles from where I would have started in Africa. So 16,000 on the irregular map, 13,000 on the more accurate map, and then 9,000 to Australia gives us an idea about how far people had to move. And remember the process I was explaining. How many generations would it take before you were successful enough to move the distance to actually migrate slowly, not by literally trying to find a new place thousands of miles away? People had no reason to do that. They would need another food source because they had overgrown, the population of the people had overgrown the area they were in, so they then moved to the next place and they would do the same thing. And remember, the first group is still growing too. So they'd be moving down south, they'd be moving up the rivers and so forth, and then people would continually, the second group here, when there's a group here, would have to move over another 100 miles from them to continue it, and now you might have 2 or 3 groups moving, so now all of a sudden they're moving not just 100 miles, but you've got 3 different groups covering a 300-mile area to create the same land necessary. So as we were discussing, as the families grew bigger, they would have to divide and move. And if they were in fact a waterside group of people, that they had found success in living off of both the food immediately available in the ocean by the shore and the land behind it, then it wouldn't have taken very long for the groups to migrate hundreds of miles and even thousands of miles. If 5 or 6 generations moved 100 miles and a generation was 15 years, they could easily move 1,000 miles in a matter of 1,000 or less years. So that would suggest that we've had multiple opportunities to move through there. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story about the waterside adventure that I've come up with, which might help you understand better how a family might survive on the waterside. Imagine or visualize a waterfront scene. You're on a gently sloping sandy beach. It's got trees in the background where the land actually starts, and then you can see the water going out toward a bay or some kind of an alcove, not the open ocean necessarily, but someplace relatively protected, and nearby a fresh water source coming in, a river, creek, something with fresh water. Now, on the shore, you see a young man gathering mussels. He's carrying sticks with him, using them to dig up the mussels. Off into the water, you see a young woman, his sister, with a baby. And she's just standing out in the water, basically up to her armpits, the baby cuddled on her shoulder, and she's steadying herself, standing there with several sticks of her own. Now, off to the side, you see another older man, an uncle, who is up to his waist in the water, but far enough away from the shore that there's not too close to be worried about anything. And he's basically watching the boy and the boy's sister, his nephew and niece. So they're there, and all of a sudden the sister yells out. The boy immediately takes off running into the water, dives into the water, and starts swimming toward his sister. Out of the woods bounds a saber-toothed tiger. Full speed ahead at the water, at the boy, food. So chases the boy into the water. The boy's swimming, gliding easily away from the shore. The saber-toothed tiger is following after him, and all of a sudden sees the girl and realizes the boy's further away because the boy's circling around and the girl's closer. So the tiger starts going toward the girl. Well, as soon as the girl sees that, she takes the baby, puts her on her back, and throws her hair back there for the baby to grab onto. And now the girl has both arms, and she can take one of the poles and stab at saber-toothed tiger coming toward her, or even pushing the head under the water with her stick. If the tiger still comes, the girl can just start swimming away, the baby riding on the back, hanging onto the hair. Now, while this is all going on, the uncle is moving around toward the shore, toward the back of the saber-toothed tiger, and then the boy has come around toward the shore where they're standing up to their waist in the water, which is higher than the saber-toothed tiger would be. And so the saber-toothed tiger, realizing they can't get to the girl or the baby, is starting to make their way back to the shore. But now the two, the boy and the man, has got their long poles, and they're pushing the tiger back out into the water and pushing the head under the water until finally the saber-toothed tiger drowns. Now, who is the predator? If you imagine it, that could have been a deliberate way of trapping any kind of man-eating animal to both eliminate them as a man-eating animal from your area, and also to a common way to be able to get some more meat for your family. So there's a lot of ways hunting and gathering can happen with a group of well-trained, well-organized people working together. And this is something that we need to remember in today's world. Our world can't exist without everybody being a well-organized working group, because all the efforts that anybody puts in is necessary for everybody to live. So be productive, do something, help people. All this is part of our whole society working together. That brings us back to the time frames, and my guess is the waterfront or waterside hypothesis probably offers the best logical solution to why mankind could live, prosper, and not have claws, fangs, great body strength. A lot of this happened before we had the mind capability, but take a tool, for example. If you're living on the shore, first of all, you have to open the muscles. Once you've opened the muscles, the shell itself becomes a tool. You learn very quickly how you can use these things, a rock to break the shell to open another shell. All of a sudden, you're living in a cave off the shore, which is a protected way. You can use your sticks to drive away the beast. If you've got 30 people together with sticks, you'd have to have more than a pride of lions to attack and be a problem if you're in a protected area like the mouth of a cave, properly sized cave. So, but then what happens in a cave? The rocks from the ceiling fall down, and they create anything from hammers to blades to sharp-edged things without people having any idea how to do knapping and making their own points or blades. In the early days, they could have just picked a rock up off the sand that had fallen off of one of these cave roofs when the tides came in, and they had their first blades, they had their first knives, they had their first tools. They could press open the muscles. So I think the waterfront, the waterside hypothesis has good relevance. And I don't know if it's right or wrong. Nobody does. But I don't think it should be brushed off automatically and be considered improbable. I think it's more probable than any of the other elements that have come up that I've heard so far. Certainly, if you try and have the original people crossing Africa to get to the Mediterranean, you've got mountains, you've got deserts, and who knows how big the mountains and deserts were in this time, but they were still there in this time. Plus, all the animals that think humans are just wonderful as a dinner or a breakfast or a lunch or a snack. So, once again, this is the aquatic ape theory and another theory of everything. Thank you for joining me today.